When Whitney Houston walked into that private recording studio on October 3rd, 1988, she had no idea she was about to create the greatest musical collaboration that would never be heard. What happened in those 4 hours with Michael Jackson would haunt both their careers forever. The duet they recorded was so powerful, so revolutionary, that three major networks refused to air it. 35 years later, those who were in that room still get chills talking about the magic that was buried by an industry too afraid to let two legends truly soar together. October 3rd, 1988. Soundworks Studio, Los Angeles. 9:30 p.m. The call had come to Whitney 3 days earlier. Michael's voice on the other end, quiet but determined. "Whitney, I have an idea. Something the labels will hate, but something the music needs. Can you meet me at Soundworks? Just you, me, and the music." Whitney had been at home in New Jersey when her private line rang. Hearing Michael's voice was surprising, but the intensity in his tone made her pay attention. "What kind of idea?" she'd asked. "The kind that reminds people why music matters," Michael replied. "I can't explain over the phone, but I think we could create something together that neither of us could create alone." Whitney had been riding the wave of Where Do Broken Hearts Go, her seventh consecutive #1 hit. She was untouchable in 1988, the voice that defined a generation, the Newark church girl who'd conquered pop radio while keeping her gospel soul intact. But something in Michael's voice intrigued her. The king of pop didn't make casual requests. Michael had his own reasons for reaching out. Bad was dominating the charts, but he felt artistically isolated. The bigger his fame grew, the fewer genuine connections he made. Whitney was different. She had respect from both the street and the suite, credibility in gospel, R&B, and pop. Most importantly, she had a voice that could match his artistic ambitions. But what neither of them knew was that this private session would create something so groundbreaking that it would threaten the very structure of how the music industry operated. Soundworks Studio was chosen specifically for its discretion. No paparazzi knew about the booking. No record label executives were invited. Just Quincy Jones, who had produced for both artists, and a small team of trusted engineers. This wasn't about marketing or chart strategies. This was about two musical perfectionists exploring what was possible when you removed all boundaries. The studio itself felt charged with anticipation. Engineer Bruce Swedian, who had worked on Thriller, adjusted microphone levels with unusual care. The piano had been tuned twice to ensure perfect pitch. Even the lighting had been dimmed to create an intimate atmosphere that would encourage vulnerability rather than performance. "Whitney," Michael said as she entered Studio A, his famous shy smile breaking across his face. "Thank you for trusting me with this." Whitney looked around the room at the setup. Two microphones positioned perfectly for a duet, a piano, and a simple drum kit. She could feel the weight of possibility in the air. This wasn't just another recording session. This felt like something that could change everything. Whitney looked around the room at the setup. Two microphones positioned perfectly for a duet, a piano, and a simple drum kit. "Michael, what exactly are we doing here?" "Something that's never been done," he replied. "A song that blends everything we both do best. Gospel runs, pop hooks, R&B soul, rock energy. Something that would make the radio programmers' heads explode because they wouldn't know how to categorize it." Quincy stepped forward, holding sheet music. "I've been working on this arrangement for months. It starts as a ballad, builds into a gospel testimony, then explodes into a rock anthem. But it only works if both of you commit completely." Whitney studied the music. The song was Man in the Mirror, restructured as a duet, with new verses written specifically to showcase her vocal range and spiritual background. The arrangement was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. "Michael," Whitney said slowly, "this isn't just a duet. This is a statement about breaking down barriers, about what music can be when you stop worrying about market segments." "Exactly," Michael nodded. "That's why the networks are going to hate it. But that's also why it needs to exist." What they created in the next 4 hours would redefine what musical collaboration could accomplish. They started with the ballad section, Michael's tender opening verse about self-reflection, then Whitney joining with harmonies that lifted the melody into something ethereal. Her voice wrapped around his like silk around steel, creating textures that neither could achieve alone. If you want to make the world a better place, Michael sang, his voice carrying that distinctive vulnerability that made him relatable despite his superstar status. Take a look at yourself and make a change, Whitney responded. But her delivery carried the weight of gospel testimony, the conviction of someone who'd found truth in church pews and was sharing it with the world. The second verse belonged to Whitney. She rewrote the lyrics on the spot, drawing from her own experience as a young black woman trying to maintain authenticity while achieving mainstream success. I see kids in the mirror with dreams they're told to hide, voices told to whisper when they should be filled with pride. Michael provided counterpoint, his vocals dancing around hers, sometimes supporting, sometimes challenging, always complimenting. When Whitney hit her melismatic runs, those lightning-fast cascades of notes that had become her signature, Michael provided percussive vocal rhythms that turned her voice into a complete musical experience. But the real magic happened when they reached the bridge. Whitney began singing in pure gospel style, channeling every Sunday morning she'd spent at New Hope Baptist Church. Every lesson her mother Sissy had taught her about using voice as a vessel for spirit. Change starts in the soul, moves through the heart, spreads through the voice, and tears the world apart. Michael joined her, but instead of matching her gospel delivery, he brought his rock sensibilities. His voice became urgent, desperate, the sound of someone who'd achieved everything but was still searching for meaning. The contrast should have been jarring, but instead it created something entirely new. Gospel rock with pop accessibility and R&B soul. The engineers in the booth were standing. Quincy was shaking his head in amazement. They were witnessing something that transcended typical music industry categories. For the final chorus, both singers let loose completely. Whitney's voice soared into her upper register, demonstrating the full power of her range, while Michael provided intricate harmonies that showed his often overlooked vocal sophistication. When Whitney hit the high note on Change, Michael was there with a counter melody that turned her solo moment into a duet conversation. The song ended with both voices in perfect unison, then fading to just Whitney's voice carrying the final "Man in the Mirror" with a whisper that seemed to echo from the churches of her childhood. Total silence in the studio for 10 seconds, then applause from everyone present. "That," said Quincy quietly, "is why music exists." But the magic was just beginning. They decided to record a second song, an acoustic version of Greatest Love of All, with Michael providing guitar and harmonies. This version stripped away all production, leaving just two voices, one guitar, and the kind of raw emotion that reminded everyone why these two artists had conquered the world. Whitney's lead vocal was more intimate than any recorded version, while Michael's harmonies showed a side of his artistry that his dance pop hits rarely displayed. When they reached the line, "Learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all," their voices blended into something that sounded less like performance and more like prayer. But then came the moment that would haunt the music industry for decades. As they wrapped the session, Michael suggested they try one more experiment, a completely improvised piece. No lyrics written in advance, no predetermined melody. Just two voices, a piano, and whatever came from their hearts in that moment. What emerged was 5 minutes of pure musical conversation. Whitney would sing a phrase, Michael would respond. He would offer a melody, she would transform it. They created harmonies that existed only in that room, at that moment, between those two people. The improvisation touched on every genre both had mastered. Gospel call and response, pop hooks, R&B grooves, rock power, even elements of jazz and classical music. It was a musical autobiography of two artists who'd spent their lives absorbing every form of American music and were now distilling it into something completely original. When it ended naturally, neither singer wanted to speak. They'd touched something sacred, something that couldn't be reproduced or manufactured. It was the sound of two musical souls recognizing each other completely. The playback session the next day was equally magical. Michael had invited a small group of trusted friends and collaborators to hear the recordings. Diana Ross was there, along with Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, and Paul McCartney. These weren't casual listeners. These were artists who understood the craft and could recognize something extraordinary. Smokey Robinson sat in the back corner, tears streaming down his face during the improvised piece. Berry Gordy Jr., the founder of Motown, kept shaking his head in amazement, muttering "impossible" under his breath. Even Lionel Richie, himself a masterful collaborator, appeared stunned by the musical conversation he was witnessing. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. This wasn't just good music. This was revolutionary music. The duet version of Man in the Mirror created a new template for collaboration, while the Greatest Love of All remake showed how familiar songs could be completely reinvented through the right musical partnership. But the improvised piece left everyone speechless. 5 minutes of pure musical telepathy that redefined what collaboration could sound like. That, said Aretha Franklin, herself the Queen of Soul, is the sound of the future. That's what music becomes when you stop limiting it to categories. Stevie Wonder, whose own genre-defying career had spanned decades, nodded slowly. I've never heard anything like that. It's like listening to music from 20 years in the future. This is what happens when two souls speak the same language. But Diana Ross, who'd been in the industry longer than anyone present, saw the problem immediately. It's too good, too revolutionary. The industry isn't ready for this. She was right, but none of them realized just how right she was. Within 48 hours, word had leaked to the major networks and record labels. The response was swift and unanimous. This collaboration could not be released. The leak came from a cleaning crew member at Soundworks. By the time studio management realized what had happened, the information had reached music industry journalists and record label executives. Phone calls began immediately. The message was consistent. This collaboration would destabilize carefully constructed marketing strategies. The reasons were complex but came down to industry control. Whitney was positioned as the wholesome crossover artist who brought R&B to mainstream pop. Michael was the eccentric genius whose carefully managed image couldn't be complicated by external collaborations. A duet this powerful would upset the careful marketing categories that made both artists profitable. More troubling to executives was the racial politics of 1988. Despite both artists' crossover success, the industry still operated on strict demographic assumptions. Whitney was black radio, Michael was pop radio. A collaboration that explicitly blended gospel, R&B, pop and rock would force programmers to choose sides, or worse, create a new category that could destabilize existing market structures. The phone call came to Whitney first. Clive Davis, her mentor at Arista Records, was direct. "Whitney, I know about the session with Michael. It can't be released. It would damage both your careers." "How could music this good damage anything?" Whitney asked. "Because it's too good," Clive replied. "It makes everything else on the radio sound small. DJs wouldn't know how to follow it. It would make other artists look limited. Sometimes the industry isn't ready for quantum leaps." Michael received a similar call from his team at Epic Records. The message was the same. The collaboration was too revolutionary for the current market. But the real pressure came from the television networks that had been expecting to air the duet as a special event. MTV, which had been negotiating to premiere the Man in the Mirror duet video, suddenly backed out. The explanation was vague but pointed to scheduling conflicts and market research concerns. In reality, MTV's research had shown that the duet was so powerful, it overshadowed everything else on their playlist. Test audiences weren't just impressed, they were ruined for other music. After hearing Whitney and Michael together, everything else sounded limited. Focus group participants used words like life-changing and transcendent. One viewer wrote, "This makes everything else on MTV sound like amateur hour." The same pattern repeated with NBC, CBS, and ABC. Network executives held emergency meetings. Bob Iger at ABC expressed concerns about raising the bar too high for other programming. At CBS, programming director Jeff Sagansky worried that airing the duet would create unrealistic expectations for musical performance television. Each network had invested heavily in developing relationships with other artists. Airing a collaboration this revolutionary would inevitably diminish the perceived value of every other musical act on their rosters. It was a business calculation disguised as creative concerns. 3 weeks after the session, both artists met again at Soundworks to listen to the recordings one more time. "They're scared," Michael said simply as the final notes of the improvised piece faded. "They should be," Whitney replied. "This changes everything. It shows what's possible when you stop accepting limitations." They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the ambient sounds of the studio. "What do we do?" Whitney asked. Michael looked at the master tapes sitting on the console. "We protect it. We make sure it survives. Someday, when the industry is ready, or when people demand better music, this will matter." They agreed to keep the session secret. The tapes would be stored safely, protected but not promoted. Both artists would continue their solo careers, but they'd carry the knowledge of what they'd created together. The decision to bury the collaboration affected both artists profoundly. For Whitney, it reinforced her growing suspicion that the industry valued her marketability more than her artistry. The session with Michael had shown her new possibilities for her voice, new ways to blend her gospel training with contemporary sounds. Being forced to hide that evolution felt like being asked to diminish herself. For Michael, the suppressed collaboration deepened his sense of artistic isolation. He'd found a genuine creative partner, someone who could match his ambitions and push him into unexplored territory. Losing that partnership reminded him how few people in his life saw him as an artist rather than a commodity. Both artists would reference the session in oblique ways in later interviews, but never directly. Whitney would talk about collaborations that never saw daylight and music that was too honest for the marketplace. Michael would mention songs that existed only for the people in the room and the gap between what artists create and what audiences are allowed to hear. The impact of the hidden collaboration extended beyond just Whitney and Michael. Quincy Jones would later say it was the most musically sophisticated session he'd ever produced. The engineers who worked that night would use it as their personal gold standard for vocal recording. The artists who attended the playback session would spend years trying to recreate the magic they'd witnessed. But perhaps the most profound impact was on music itself. The session proved that genre boundaries were artificial constructs that limited rather than enhanced artistic expression. It showed that collaboration between equals could create something entirely new, something that transcended the individual achievements of even the most talented artists. Today, the original tapes remain in a climate-controlled vault, protected but unheard by the wider world. Quincy Jones, now in his 90s, still speaks of that session as the one that got away. The few people who heard the recordings described them as the future of music and what collaboration should sound like. Music historians who know about the session argue that its suppression represents one of the greatest losses in recording history. They point out that the collaboration would have influenced an entire generation of artists, potentially leading to more adventurous, more integrated music throughout the 1990s. The irony is that by 1995, the music industry was ready for exactly what Whitney and Michael had created in 1988. Hip-hop had broken down genre barriers, world music was influencing mainstream pop, and artists were routinely blending styles that had previously been kept separate. The collaboration that seemed too revolutionary in 1988 would have seemed natural just 7 years later. Both artists carried the memory of that session for the rest of their lives. Friends report that Whitney would sometimes reference the song that could have changed everything, while Michael was known to play bits of the recordings for trusted visitors to Neverland Ranch. When Whitney died in 2012, Michael had already been gone for 3 years. The secret of their collaboration died with them, known only to the small group of people who'd been present that October night in 1988. The question that haunts music lovers who know about the session is simple. What would music have become if the greatest collaboration of the 20th century had been allowed to see daylight? How many barriers would have been broken? How many new possibilities would have opened? We'll never know for certain. But those who heard Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson create pure magic together on October 3, 1988, insist that we lost more than just 2 songs. We lost a glimpse of what music could be when fear stops limiting imagination. The secret duet between Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson represents the road not taken, the collaboration that was too perfect for an imperfect industry. It reminds us that sometimes the most important art is the art that never gets the chance to change the world. In a vault in Los Angeles, those recordings still wait. They wait for an industry brave enough to handle revolution. They wait for audiences ready to hear music without boundaries. They wait for a world that values artistic truth over market research. And perhaps someday, when we're ready for music that perfect, that revolutionary, that honest, we'll finally hear what Whitney and Michael created together in a private studio on a Tuesday night in 1988. Until then, it remains the greatest song never heard, the collaboration that proved what's possible when genius recognizes genius and fear doesn't get in the way. The secret Whitney Michael duet isn't just music history's greatest what if. It's a reminder that the most important art often happens when nobody's watching, when artists are free to be completely honest with each other and with their craft. The story of this hidden collaboration has taken on mythical status among music insiders. Young artists who hear accounts of the session often express disbelief that such music could be deliberately suppressed. In recent years, as both artists' legacies have been reevaluated, the hidden collaboration has become a symbol of what we lose when fear governs creativity. Those who were present that night remain protective of the memory. They speak of it in reverent terms, as if describing a religious experience. Sometimes the most powerful music is the music that never gets played. And sometimes the greatest collaborations are the ones that exist only in the memories of those lucky enough to witness pure magic being born. The tapes wait in their vault, a testament to what artists can achieve when they're free to follow their instincts without compromise. They wait for a world ready to hear music without boundaries, collaboration without limitations, art without fear.